Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I particularly want to thank Dr. Suleiman Shahid and people from LUMS X who've worked really hard to put together this excellent summit. And I'm sure you're going to have an exciting day of talks today. Um, I'm sort of not an education researcher. Suleiman asked me to basically jump in and sort of give some views. So what I'm going to be sharing today is basically, sort of some ideas that I've been developing over the years about how technology and the skills landscape has been changing. I'm an economist. I'm a development economist that has looked at these things over the years. But the other thing that I want to bring to bear to this conversation is my role as an educator. So I've been teaching students for 25 years, almost entirely in the Pakistani context. I've taught them at LUMS, basically both at the graduate and the undergraduate level. But the nice thing, and I see kind of like my sort of colleague Faisal Bari, for whom I've learned a tremendous amount, that Faisal and I have been for most part of those 25 years teaching first years. So first years are when school kids come into university, and I think it gives you an insight which is quite interesting. And the second thing is that basically over the years, essentially, we've seen a lot of the generational shift that Shahid Saab was talking about. So it's in that role that I want to give and share some ideas. So it's interesting. I was hearing Suleiman, I heard Shahid Saab, we talk about disruption, but what really is disruption and how do we actually think about disruption? So let me kind of give you a context. If you think about technological disruption and you look at, we have very good data now about sort of how growth happened in the human world, starting from about 1000 AD. I should have actually maybe put that slide up, but I don't have it. But if you look at for the first 800 of those years, GDP growth is almost flat, right? So the best way to describe it is like the heartbeat of a dead person. It's a flat line. And then something happens around the 18th, sort of 19th century, 17th century, and growth starts to pick up, and it picks up exponentially. And two things shift, which we don't really appreciate. One, the wealth of societies, starting with Britain, of course, and of course, colonialism, and these things had a lot to do with it. It sort of catapults, but as it catapults upwards in a very exponential fashion, so does productivity. So human societies become tremendously productive, and they liberate themselves from land and become dependent on human capital. And that's the big transformation that starts to happen. And then what you start to see is you start to see a catch up with society after society actually growing exponentially with different rates of exponential growth. The other big transformation that happens is that if you look at the first 800 years, people die very young. So again, people don't appreciate this, but in colonial India, even for white colonial officials, the average age was something like 28, and they would die from things like dysentery. And now I have my wife has a nephew who's very bright, was dragging his feet about getting married. Mother was getting very, very worried. He's a doctor, a leading doctor in the world. And I was given the task to try and convince him. And he said to me, he said, look, my average life is going to be around 120, right? So if I get married at around 40, I'm doing just as well as my parents, if you normalize it with mortality. So what's happened is longevity of life and healthiness of life have increased in the past 200 years, and we don't actually appreciate it. But with those disruptions, what we also see is that the world is not equal. The world is not inclusive, right? When the Industrial Revolution happened, wealth of societies, starting with Britain, went up very fast, but real wages took about 150 years to catch up. in terms of exponential growth. And in those 150 years, the best insight you can get is by just picking up any Charles Dickens novels, because it's about destitution, it is about disease, it is about fragility, and it is about poverty. So there may be upsides to disruption, but there are massive downsides to disruption too. And how do you navigate this terrain is really what human choice would have to be about. So it's in that context, I just want to present some thoughts. So, and some of the people, colleagues from LUMS, have probably seen these graphs a million times, so sort of they should excuse this. But I've recently been looking at this. The World Economic Forum does this survey of top employers in the world. And if you look at this survey, what it's simply doing is really asking people about the shared disruption of skills that they expect. These are employers. These black bars over here are basically the proportion of the skills that they employers think are no longer going to be relevant in the future. There's just a proportion. It's just saying, here are a set of skills which you think are core. Tell us out of this list what proportion is just going to become irrelevant in the future. And you see it's a very high amount, right? So employers expect massive disruption to happen, right? The other interesting thing is, if you look at what is it that they actually value, how do they think that this landscape is actually going to evolve? So this vertical axis is skills that they say are core today. So these are what they think in 2023 were core skills. And this is what they think should be the reskilling focus for a job market for tomorrow. What's interesting is, so anything that's up here is core today, and it's going to be important tomorrow, right? If you think about it, the two big skills that pop up are analytical thinking and creative thinking. Something actually no education system right now is putting much weight on. If you think of things like reading, writing, and numeracy, actually it doesn't show up in the upper right-hand quadrant. Or you can pick other things over here, which is what we think about as specialized technical skills that the education system is focused a lot on. And I think what this reflects is really how job markets have evolved. So, my parents' generation, my generation, basically the job market was as follows. You went and you picked a skill, you took a job, you entered it, and you climbed the ladder to retire in it. So if you're an accountant, you wanted to retire as an accountant. If you became a doctor, you're going to spend your life being a doctor. This is not what the future job market is going to look like. This job market is going to constantly be disrupted. That's what these employers are saying. So we have to not only start thinking about skills in a very different fashion, and as educators to start thinking about how do you impart these skills, but actually what we also have to start really thinking about is that the way people will have to navigate their careers is going to look very differently. There's a very brilliant development economist called Chris Blattman. I think he's Chicago now. He really talks about so he's talking about poor people. Poor people in developing societies are a lot like that. They never have careers, if you think about it. So you just track anybody who works in your home, who's a driver or a cook. It's not like they grew up at 18 and thought, I'm going to become a cook or a driver. If you take their path to a job, they'll have done all sorts of jobs throughout their life to end up somewhere or the other. So Blattman calls these things portfolios of work. So they're not careers, they're portfolios of work. But what's going to happen at the upper end of the job market is also going to be about portfolios of work, and it's not going to be about specialized jobs. That's what this data is showing, and that's what a lot of work is showing, and we need to start to think about that very, very seriously. Now, what's interesting is this is what employers are saying, but if you look at what learners are doing, so this is sort of just, again, the reskilling focus, and this is the types of courses people are opting for in Coursera. Remember, sort of critical thinking, analytical thinking were courses. So this is the reskilling focus from the employers. This is what people are taking. So people are still focused on things like programming, design. But very few people are actually picking up courses that are going to strengthen their analytical and creative thinking. So it's not like the learners are adapting, right? So the future, the direction of the future, and where the learners are, there's a big gap. So it's about how do you match that gap, and I think that's where the education sector has to show a lot of leadership. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to have a huge amount of actually highly educated, talented people who are massively underprepared to navigate this future job market. And let me also translate for you what analytical thinking and creative thinking mean in terms of jobs. What they mean is that they're training you on how to think and how to learn so that you can constantly navigate. They're not here to teach you how to become a good accountant. It's about how do you actually learn so that you can cross navigate if your job in the accountancy profession gets disrupted altogether. Then you have the ability to reskill yourself to go somewhere else. If people don't have that innate ability that is developed, then no matter us throwing those courses, us talking about lifelong learning, us talking about disruptions, it's just going to be that it's going to be really hard for people to navigate. The second big disruption is AI, and I thought I'd do something cute, which is to ask AI about how dystopic AI is. And actually, AI is very reflective about how dystopic AI is. So I just popped in a question, say, write a para on the role of AI and de-skilling students, because this is something that as educators we struggle with. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole para, but AI says, well, relying too heavily on AI learning can reduce the need for deep comprehension and analysis. And that's quite a deep statement, right? So when you think about sort of the ability to learn, then you also have to have the skill for deep comprehension. But if you're constantly going to throw AI at kids and they start to use that as a crutch, it reminds me about those bikes, those tricycles that people used to use, that at some point you have to kind of get those wheels off. What AI is going to start to do is put those wheels back on, right? And then, it points out very correctly that its students may prioritize quick solutions over understanding underlying concepts. And it says it could discourage persistence in grappling with complex problems, right? I mean, that's how the human mind develops. It's about persisting to unravel complex problems. But if you take that persistence and make it easy, then you take a skill away. And I think that is something as educators that we need to start to take extremely seriously. The other thing, which is kind of mechanical, but I think actually even today where we're standing, the assessment system is dead. We're in denial about it. We still think we can make exams. Like take-home exams are now hugely, hugely challenged, because it's going to be really difficult for us to actually find out how much was supported by AI and how much effort did the student do. Now, the standard response, which is Vani Saab is here, is a good PAS officer, which is a very PAS officer response. कि invigilators भर्ती कर लें, उनको classroom में बैठा दें और उनके सर पे invigilators बैठा दें. That's not going to do the trick, right? So how do we think about assessments? Like plagiarism is going to become very difficult to detect. Even basically within exams, there could be all sorts of things. But I think we need to have not only assessments, but students, when you talk about Gen Z, you have to get Gen Z to take ownership over their learning journey. So the policing model is just going to be massively difficult to actually enforce because it's become extremely costly to do that, right? So how do we develop that ethic? How do we develop that investment and that ownership to say, I'm coming to university to learn, right? I tell my students this, I said, the biggest irony in this world is AI. Here's a technology that's going to de-skill you, and then your employer is going to tell you, you're so de-skilled that I'm going to replace you with AI. You couldn't get a bigger irony than that. And I think, how do we turn that to use? Because where AI is very good, particularly if they're kids who are skill challenged, that if they have the ethics and the ownership, then they can use AI to navigate like deficiencies in that language. You know, how do you get to a complex idea, right? Those are things that could be reinforcing, but provided your investment is that in learning in the first place. So you can't get rid of that problem. In fact, solving that problem becomes really, really important. The third big disruption, and you find it in all schools, you find it in the university. I took over as vice chancellor in January. It hit me like, you know, the smog hits you in December, is this thing about the emergence of the anxious generation, right? This is a set of graphs, so really, so from the American College Health Association, but it's from a book by Jonathan Haidt, which I recommend everybody should read. I mean, what it's basically showing you is it's tracking data on anxiety, depression, ADHD. But what you can see is that post 2010, there seems to be an exponential growth in things like anxiety and depression, right? And this is US undergraduate students. And we're finding very similar things in different contexts, even in the global South, right? Now, we don't really understand why this divergence or why this break actually happens, but we're still treating it. And you know, it's again, it's a shift. It could be that this conversation has become a bigger conversation, so you know, people have started to reveal it. But we come from what's called the boot camp generation. You just kind of put your chin up and you kind of just went through life, you know, whether you were coping or you weren't coping. Well, guess what? Not coping is on the table and we have to deal with it. And I think that's another disruption of another sort that we have to think about. And what's interesting in this data is that it doesn't, it's kind of this exponential rise doesn't really show up in like the older cohorts, right? So it's showing up basically in the 18 to 25 years old, which is the generation that Shahid Saab was talking about when he said, the free thinkers are also anxious thinkers. So how do we deal with this? How do we change this conversation? So Hyatt, like I said, I'm not like a researcher of this issue. I mean, these are interesting questions that I actually think are very worth thinking about in our context. But he kind of has two big things that he puts on the table. One is he says that with this codification of education, of jobs, there's been a decline of play-based childhood. So, you know, play was a very important part of childhood. I remember, you know, when I went to college as an undergraduate, there was no expectation about what you did. You went to, you know, college was the time that you found yourself in some sense. Except now, you know, even a first year comes and tells you, well, I'm picking this course Could you tell me what the return on the investment on this course is going to be for my jobs? And you're like, what do you want to do in life? And that's a question that's off the table. And the second thing is what he calls the rise of phone-based childhood. So, phone-based childhood is where basically, the virtual world has this freedom to navigate, and then you have the formalized space, which has become more and more regimented. You have school systems which pick an assessment mechanism and then shove everybody into a path which only trains them for that taking that assessment test, starting grade 4 or grade 5. And it's not really about how do you develop creativity. It's not about how you develop lateral thinking. It's just get them to climb this ladder, and that's about it. So I think this is another disruption that we have to think about, but the collateral of that destruction seems to be a rise in anxiety and stuff like that. Another collateral, and this is a really nice article, I can circulate it, The Slate by Adam Kotsoko, who was an instructor in the US. He says, 10 years into my college teaching career, students stopped being able to read effectively. He's not talking about schools in Pakistani districts that are learning challenged. He's talking about actually pretty well-resourced US schools. So some skills are just going off the table. And those are very key skills to develop deep comprehension. So how do we actually revive those interests are also challenges that we need to take seriously. The third big thing, which is a challenge, which has been there for some time actually, it's just that it's unacknowledged and we started to talk about it, is the diversity of learning in the classroom, right? The most extreme manifestation of that is basically kids having learning disabilities. This is again data from the US, but it's pretty similar over here. What you start to see is, the numbers are pretty stark. This is 6 to 21-year-olds percentage of children having been identified to have a learning disability. Of course, this is a huge underestimate because many kids simply won't get tested, right? What we also have a lot of good data on now, these are NAP test scores by disability status, is basically if you have a disability, so the kind of, this blue is eighth graders. The blue rounds are the eighth graders who have not been identified with disabilities. And the red rounds basically are kids who have been identified with having a disability. And you can see the levels are pretty different. And the diamonds are fourth graders. And again, the blues are above the reds. So this is average reading scores. You have a similar pattern in average math scores. And this is reading below the basic level. And you can see in fourth graders, if you have a disability, it's really off the charts, right? But you put a lot of these kids together in class, and you try and teach the average. And we have no way of actually separating as to what those education plans ought to be. And I think here technology has actually an important role to play, because technology should be able to actually respond and tell you what different needs are. So this is where we can make a big dent. But again, we need to take this problem very, very seriously. The last thing, which I think is tremendously important for Pakistan, is basically we also have to use education to change stereotypes. So this is not data from Pakistan, but there's kind of huge gender stereotyping in different types of jobs. This is just percentage of students in the US. Actually, it's not just the US, or no, it is the US. Basically, the purples are males and the blues are females. So you can see education sector or education-related courses tend to have a lot more women, but you look at courses like information and communication technology, engineering and marketing, it's much more male. A lot of this gender stereotyping starts in schools and in homes. So how does kind of education actually transform this, right? How does it sort of give confidence to break those barriers to be able to say, these are the fields we can go into, is going to become extremely important. And it's particularly going to be extremely important for Pakistan because if you look at female labor force participation, Pakistan has kind of one of the lowest rates in the world. And I don't think this society can transform in a positive way unless basically these gender divides are very consciously broken. And I think the education system has an important role to play. The good thing is that if particularly you look at urban cities, the gender gap in education is closing pretty fast. So it's not like girls are not coming into school, but what do those schools equip them with? And that is not only to do with giving them the skills, but also giving them the imagination that these are possible careers that you can do. Okay, so how does kind of conventional education stack up against all of these challenges? And I think it stacks up pretty poorly. So basically conventional education, as we see it in Pakistan, is really about disciplines and tools. It's not about building critical and analytical skills. And it's become over the years more and more grade and exam focused, right? So everybody is teaching to the test. The test has become the reality, right? Everything else has gone into the background. And the best manifestation to that is academies in Pakistan, and they're a great business opportunity. What's their job? Their job is not to make people learn. Their job is to train people to sit specific tests, right? Um, our education system is also very segmented, segregated. It's for the upper, what we call the elite schools or high fee schools. It's very unresponsive to diversity context, right? Like, I was saying to somebody that my grandparents' generation was actually quintilingual, right? And now you get kids coming out of Pakistani schools who are not even bilingual. And that's another big journey that we've seen in our own lifetime. And that means that the embeddedness of the education system, with the context in which it is reproducing itself, is just got, there's been a disjuncture. So how do you build that back? And it hugely underemphasizes humanistic thinking, critical thinking, analytical thinking. And even OA levels has become, like in I did metric and FA, the great curriculum, but all they made us do was learn to sit the exam, right? So there's nothing wrong with the curriculum, is what we were being made to do. The irony is OA levels has become pretty similar, not the other way around. Um, these are just kind of graphs about sort of outcomes. This is learning poverty. You can see Pakistan, even in the regional context, does really badly. This is learning deprivation. So learning deprivation is just percentage of children of primary age who read below their minimum age level or proficiency level, right? So Pakistan is an outlier. So this emergency is pretty emergent in our particular context. But what about kind of well-resourced schools? So here what I see is students excel technically. They're incredibly bright, but they really struggle with articulation and critical reasoning. It's not that they don't have the ability, it's just that they have had 10 years of just preparing to take the test, right? So you say, forget the test and think about it a little bit. It's a bit of an alien exercise that you're making them do. But if you actually debate with them on Twitter, they're going to give you a run for your money, right? Like that disjuncture is a disjuncture that we want to turn around. But the kind of worst kind of part about this is that the system does not get people to invest in asking questions. So, you do a simple exercise. You take bright undergraduates or high school students and you say, okay, what do you want to do? What are the big questions that excite you? And they don't think like that. They don't think in terms of questions. or they don't link education to thinking about questions. And how can people learn to learn if they don't have questions that they're engaging themselves in? There has to be a starting point. So the education system has to give them the ability to ask a question. And I think that is extremely, extremely important. So if you think about an education future, I think it has to be about creating curriculums that integrate critical reasoning, ethics, humanistic inquiry, and embed students in our context and break stereotypes. It's about rewiring childhoods through mainstreaming creative arts and play. I think that has to be brought back in, whether they're being tested, not tested. That's leveraging technology to create customized learning paths and assessments. And I think lastly, and Faisal and I went through this, like we've always been well-rated teachers. There was a bit of a dip pre-COVID, and then everybody told us COVID is coming, we're going to tank, and we actually did better in terms of student assessments. And the reason we did this was that we actually started to teach actively. So we flipped the classroom in some sense by putting in some tools of assessment in which we got kids to be active presenters of material rather than passive recipients of material. And when we took that journey, it sort of occurred to me that, what is really passive lecturing about? It's about being a parrot, right? Tota, right? Which is, you have this material which students can read, they choose not to read it. So what you do is you create lectures and slides, and then you deliver the lectures and slides to deliver the material which students who haven't read the material are now sitting and taking notes about, right? That's not what is an effective use of a classroom. The effective use of a classroom is students actually read some stuff, they figure out what they're being challenged, you come into the classroom, and they ask you the questions and you clarify what they're getting lost on. So that's very effective, right? But again, if it's all about just creating the notes to take a test at the end, then there's a problem, right? But if you're really saying the class is a chance for me to learn from this person, then the equation sort of flips. And I think that flipping has to be not only about the curriculum, it also has to be about changing the assessment framework almost entirely. Um, so those are kind of the big challenges. So for me, and I'd add one other thing, which I think is really important, is engaged citizenship. When we think about education, we also need to think about the question about what are we trying to do? What is the student we're trying to prepare? And for me, creating engaged citizens has to be at the top of the priority, but this is a kind of visual about what I think should be a new education pact purely as an educator. And I thank you for your patience. Thank you.